Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is the Jim Rutt Show. This is a Currents episode. Currents are shorter and less heavily produced than our full-length episodes and generally focus on a single topic. As always, links to books, articles, and organizations mentioned are available on the episode page at jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com.
Today's guest is Jim Rutt. I'm Jared Janes, the producer of The Jim Rutt Show, and I'm taking over the hosting privileges momentarily, mostly because we're going to be talking just about The Jim Rutt Show, and it's always awkward talking to yourself, so I thought I'd lend Jim a hand here. We also have an announcement that probably is the best place to start. Jim, did you want to kind of talk about what's in store for the show, what's going to be changing in the immediate future?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. This is a great opportunity to reflect on a little over 2 years experience with the Jim Rutt Show. And Jared has been my trusty producer for most of that time. And, if you like the sound quality and the show notes and the website and all that, that's Jared and his team have done a wonderful job of taking care of us here on the Jim Rutt Show. So yeah, the announcement after doing about 185 episodes over the last 2 years, something like that, I've decided to ramp back the rate. I kept doing more and more and more because there's just so many interesting people and so many interesting books and so many interesting articles and papers to read that by 2021, I was doing 2 to 3 episodes a week. 1 week I had 6 scheduled, which I rescheduled one. The other one had to be canceled for various reasons. So I ended up doing 4. That was nuts. And I've got some other projects that I need to work on. And so I've decided to continue the podcast, but to ramp the rate down. And so instead of 2 or 3 a week, I'm aiming for 1 or 2 or very occasionally 3 per month. And we've got some great guests scheduled. Next month, we have Robin Dunbar of the famous Dunbar number signed up, and we have a great chat with him. In September, we're doing a podcast with Heather Haying and her very interesting book written with her husband, who's also been on the show a number of times, Brett Weinstein, on evolutionary psychology and evolution in general and how it impacts culture and stuff. That's going to be very interesting. I'm going to do another episode later this week with Rob Tersick, who's been a guest on before, where we talked about his book. But this time we're going to focus narrowly on his very exciting ideas about the future of education. This is some radical stuff. And let's see, in October, I have John Vervaeke on the books. We're going to do 3 episodes, I believe. I think it could take 3 episodes. I'm currently working my way through the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, this 50-hour video series. Found it very interesting. And I've been writing copious notes. This is completely new for me. I've never tried to base a podcast, and even more a podcast cluster of episodes around video rather than the written word. I'm a written word kind of guy. So I've developed a workflow with Rome research, and I found a good source of transcripts that were already done by somebody. And so I cut and paste from them. I write notes as I'm listening. I stop and go. It's something new for me. That's looking forward. And then in, I believe, November, we will have Antonio Damasio, the very well-known cognitive scientist whose newest book will be published in late October on his newest theories on the fundamental nature of consciousness. As regular listeners to the show know, one of my favorite topics. So we're not ending the podcast, but we're cutting the rate down very substantially. So if you're not hearing the dings on your podcast app 2 or 3 times a week, it's not broken. I haven't died, but we're just reducing the flow.
And those are just the full episodes that you have planned, right?
Correct. And from time to time, I'll slip one Currents episode, a shorter, more informal episode in as, things strike my fancy or not, right? All depends.
Yeah. The Currents are, I was onboarding one of the new editors, and they're asking me about the cadence for the Currentses. And I was like, well, it's completely up to Jim's own fancies and whims. So it's completely unpredictable. They're just surprises that pop up in the queue. So that's the way I think of the Currents.
Yep. I see an article. I see a talking head on TV. Even I reached out and found them. And hey, I'd like to be on a podcast. And surprising number of people say yes, and that's where Currents comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I always, I've done some of my own podcasts in the past, and I think my favorite thing about them is just that it gives you an excuse to talk to people, and they say yes all the time. That's like the unfair advantage of networking and just having interesting conversations with people.
Yeah, no doubt about it. One of the wonderful benefits, and one of the things I certainly enjoyed a whole lot. I love talking to people, always have, and being able to talk to all kinds of interesting people who I never would have run across in my real life, so called.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, and now that we have the announcement out of the way, I thought reflecting on the show a little bit from a broad perspective would be fun. Does that motivation of being able to have fun conversations, is that tie directly into kind of why you started the thing to begin with?
More or less. So I can tell you the real origin story. Like any good comic book, the superhero has to have an origin story. The Jim Rutt Show actually started around the dinner table, the Christmas dinner table. I think it was actually between Christmas and New Year's. My daughter and her husband were down, and some other folks, and we were just sort of chatting about the year. And it was late 2018, and had spent 2018 writing a number of essays on Medium. You can check them out, Jim Rutt on Medium, on things like liquid democracy. One of my favorite ones I wrote was regaining your cognitive sovereignty, about my experiment of getting rid of my smartphone. And I describe a lot about the downside of smartphones, quoted a lot of cognitive science research on it, et cetera. And anyway, I wrote these essays, and I was proud of them. They're well done, but man, am I a slow writer. And I just revision. I have some friends that can just knock something out that's good in 4 hours. For me, say 2 months is more like it. I was complaining about this, and my daughter, in her classic daughterly talking to her dad style, says, "Dad, you may struggle with writing, but you are one of the great talkers of all time. King of bullshit." And I go, there's something to be said for that. You should have a podcast. And, of course, I knew what a podcast was, but being a man of the printed word, I really hadn't listened to podcasts too much, but took that idea under advisement. So, those who found the Jim Rutt Show to be annoying, I blame it on my daughter. Right? That was actually a really cool suggestion that she came up with. And I never would have thought of it, never would have done it, I guarantee you, if it hadn't been for that conversation. And so that spring, each year in March, I usually try to take stock of my life. I retired from my business career on April 1st, appropriately date. And so I use that as an anniversary to review what I've been doing and, how do I want to adjust the coming year? And I said, I think I'm kind of tired of writing essays, and I think I'm going to think about podcasting. And so I dug in, as I always do. I thought of it like a venture. I researched what I could find out about the podcast industry. I looked at the technology. I signed up for some of these online, learn how to be a podcaster courses, actually, that were actually fairly interesting and useful. And after about a month, I said, yeah, I can do a podcast, God damn it. And it doesn't look like it's that hard, right? By that point, 2019, the services were essentially off the shelf and inexpensive.
Mm-hmm.
Things like Zencaster, which we use to record the episodes we're using today, Dropbox, where the files can be stored. There's good low-cost editing software, et cetera. And so I said, let's do it. And so I, ramped up and started sending emails to people I knew, or even a few I didn't know. And as you said, it is pretty amazing how many people say yes to be on a podcast. And so we launched it. I think I recorded my first episode on June 2nd, 2019.
Man, time flies.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, especially being in a place where you're doing most of your sense making in written form and kind of at its own pace. I know that committing to the schedule that you did with all the guests and all of the background research and reading and things that you do for prep, kind of put you on this kind of really intense intellectual workout regimen. How do you think about how that impacted your kind of worldview and everything once the podcast got running?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as I've said on the podcast several times over the couple of years, I spend about 10 hours on average per full length episode. Often read a book, might take 3 to 6 or 7 or 8, 9 hours, 10 hours sometimes, if it's a really thick, difficult book. And then I often will do side research on the topic so that, I can challenge the guest or support the guest or point out some things that are related, et cetera. And then I usually spend 2 hours exactly preparing my show notes for the podcast before we go on the air. So it is a big time commitment, and it has consumed a fairly large amount of my reading budget. I've historically read about 75 books a year. And probably in the last 2 years, not all my podcasts are about books, but a fair percentage of them are. And I'd say particularly in the last year, I've moved even more towards book-oriented podcasts. A significant majority of my reading bandwidth has been absorbed into reading for podcasts and sort of following the ideas from them. And so, of course, I choose the topic. So it's not like, oh, yeah, the teacher made me read Rise and Fall of the Third Reich or something. And God damn it, I had to struggle my way through it. So I had to choose them. But on the other hand, they had a different trajectory than my natural reading would. And it's hard to describe exactly what the difference is, but it is different. So it did move my reading trajectory in a somewhat different direction, more towards nonfiction, kind of hardcore stuff. Historically, I read about half fiction, half nonfiction. Speaking of which, is interesting, going back, when I wrote the original prospectus for the show, I had two categories on the topics list that I never actually got to. One was literary fiction. I read a lot of literary fiction, like it a lot. But once I started doing podcasts, the first few were on more technical or social change-oriented topics. One happened to be with a fiction writer, but really more of a social change guy, Cory Doctorow, one of my early podcasts, and a good one, by the way. I said, I'm not sure what the hell I talk to a literary novelist about, right? It doesn't really seem to be what I do. So I dropped that from the list. The other one I had early on the list was the Americana music area, an area my wife and I both enjoy a lot. I've been to many, many shows over the years, and I thought it'd be a good excuse, as we were saying, to reach out to these people and talk to them, some of my musical heroes. But then I said, what the hell am I going to talk to Robert Earl Keen about? I love his music, but, or Jerry Jeff Walker or somebody like that. And I go, it doesn't really seem like what I do. So I ended up not doing any Americana music until one of my last episodes with Harvey Reid was interesting, a really phenomenal musician, though I reached out to him after looking at his book. And his book is really sort of a deep, personal, philosophical exploration of the nature of what he calls troubadour music, singer-songwriter who provides his own accompaniment, etc. So it was more about his ideas than it was about the music. So it fit in with what I've been doing. So my reading definitely changed, but not in a crazy way. These are books that I might have read, or piles of papers I might have read, but probably wouldn't have, at least maybe 2/3 of them if I had happened to be on this mission.
Yeah. Before the podcast, were you the person that reads like a bunch of books all at the same time and kind of picks them up, puts them down, or you kind of just get one done, move on? Did it actually change the whole function or the methods in which you go through books?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I tend to be a 1 or 2 book at a time person. Typically, often I'll be working on a nonfiction book. And if it's a hard one, difficult conceptual stuff that you have to read fairly slowly, I'll mix it in with fiction, some of the, trashy detective stories, rereading Lord of the Rings for the 29th time. I was on a really hard bender of reading for the podcast. I stumbled across a trashy series, one of these post-apocalyptic series called Nuclear Winter. What the hell is the guy's name? They were not bad. They were certainly readable.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like there's like a genre that just speaks to me in a way that's really interesting. And whether it's like the most high art, sophisticated and nuanced take or not, there's still an enjoyment of being immersed in an aesthetic of some sort.
Yeah, exactly. It's, the willing suspension of disbelief, as my 11th grade English teacher, Mrs. Kingsley, always taught us to think about it, and said that's the magic of writing. You say, all right, if you look at a book critically, it's never perfect, right? There's logic flaws in every thriller, which pisses me off. But if it's good writing, the willing suspension of disbelief. Bobby Akart, A-K-A-R-T, turns out he's written a very large number of post-apocalyptic novels, but there's a 5-book series called Nuclear Winter. They're very short. You can read, more than one a day. I think I was reading about 2 a day while I was power climbing my 1.5 a day. So that was kind of cotton candy for the mind. I used to love the Spencer series, detective stuff, till the guy died, and didn't know more of those. So I do read from time to time science fiction, so Anyway, I tend to be a two book at a time person, or just one. But I'm not a person who's reading 5 or 6 books simultaneously. And I will say that when I'm doing for the podcast, because I had deadlines, right? I had people booked for specific dates. And I'll confess, sometimes I was finishing the book the morning of the podcast. And so I had to, at times, just really buckle down and focus on getting the books done. I like to get them done 2 or 3 days in advance. And most of the time I did, so I could reflect a little bit and could do my notes the day prior to the podcast and then review the notes the morning of. That was optimal. But as we know, optimal and reality aren't always the same all the time.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too, you're mentioning reading the post-apocalyptic stuff, which thematically seems to be pretty resonant with a lot of the collapse scenarios and things that are a common theme on the podcast. Are there any interesting connections there, or or is this just kind of a happy coincidence?
It's probably not totally random, I'll say that. I've always been interested in discontinuous change. I liked thrillers of, long before I was thinking about Game B or anything else like that. I like that kind of stuff. I suppose I like to read these things because it highlights the large number of different ways in which advanced civilization could collapse. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about collapse, one of the things I like to say again and again and again, or being prepared, being a prepper, as people would say, is it's sort of meaningless to be a prepper or to worry too much think about even collapse, but rather you need to think about specific trajectories, specific things that happen or could happen. And, and I call it a bundle of trajectories. And so the more of those things you get exposed to, the more you're thinking about possible ways our society could collapse, how we could prevent that. And even if we don't fully prevent it, how we could make a more speedy recovery is useful. So I encourage people to read post-apocalyptic literature, at least the stuff that's realistic scenarios. I don't read at all, zombie apocalypses or stuff like that. But, give me a good pandemic apocalypse that's more or less realistic, EMP pulses, massive earthquakes, eruption of the Yellowstone caldera. That's always a good one. Or in the case of Bobby Akehart, it was a limited nuclear war, which triggered a rather severe nuclear winter. All possible scenarios that we need to be thinking about and things that we should all be working as citizens to reduce the probability, or to the degree we can't reduce the probability, like a massive solar flare, that we build robustness and resilience into things like our electrical grid so that we can get our civilization rebooted again and minimize the amount of loss.
Yeah. Well, and the one of the common themes that I hear in a lot of those scenarios too is, unlike the zombie apocalypse, they are ways of talking about how humans organize when the slate has been kind of cleaned or reset in some fundamental way. And so it's kind of that. I see it as kind of very much in a similar vein as the kind of first principles, bottom-up approach of Game B, even when it comes to community organization and things.
Yeah, though I will confess the writers tend not to explore that as much as I'd like them to. It'd be fun to write one, right? Because it's almost always the charismatic older male, right? Who tells everybody what to do. And if they don't, they die, right? And, it's really a very Game A perspective. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's very little thinking about, all right, how would a team of survivors really work in a non-hierarchical, collaborative and cooperative fashion to maximize their probability of one, first surviving, and then two, rebooting. And I can't recall really seeing much of that in the post-apocalyptic literature.
Yeah. Maybe something the sci-fi seems to be often about the reorganization, thinking of society in a different way.
Yeah, Ursula Le Guin is a classic one who did some beautiful writing back in the day on things like that. And of course, one of my old favorites, it's a weird hybrid, Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land and Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I always say, it's amazing that the same guy wrote both of those two books. One, the kind of the literary, at least back in my day, back in the 60s and 70s, the Moon is a Harsh Mistress was the libertarian favorite, and Stranger in a Strange Land was the hippie favorite. How could he have written the favorite novels of the libertarians and the hippies? But he did.
Ooh, yeah, that's maybe a mark of a real thinker when you can be seen as on two poles, very distant from one side or another. Yeah, I'm curious. Well, and this is interesting. I didn't think we'd go here, but this idea of fiction, and just the role of fiction and thinking about what's going on with today's culture and stuff like that. I feel like there's not a lot of conversations around that. Is that at least in the kind of game B sense making whatever web? It doesn't seem like a really common thing these days. Is you think we could benefit from looking towards some fiction to be a little bit more imaginative? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I've always read fiction, and I've always thought it had a good influence on opening your perspectives. What fiction did I read recently? Quality fiction. Week before last, I read War and Peace, Tolstoy's War and Peace, right? 1,100 pages of stuff. And there were a lot of ideas in there that caused one to think about how one would design a society, or what are the attributes of a society that help make it work and not work. And of course, what he was drawing was a whole series of things that don't work or are bad, like the very hierarchical, semi-feudal state that Russia was in at the time, which the time of the novel was 1805 through 1820 approximately. And then you had the military dictatorship of Napoleon on the other side as the other alternative. And so it was a sort of an exploration of social operating systems and their result in constant warfare that were good object lessons on things that one would not want in a good social operating system. But again, the writing was beautiful. This is one of these classics that the joke about it is everybody talks about it, but nobody reads it. And I'd suggest it's actually worth reading. And Tolstoy is a very easy writer. Short sentences, short paragraphs, short chapters, very clear. It was actually very enjoyable. I blasted right through it just as if it were, some, good piece of genre writing. But unfortunately, when we talk about fiction in general, I'm old enough to remember when fiction writers were some of the more famous people in our society, right? Think about John Updike, Saul Bellow, Ernest Hemingway even was alive when I was a little kid, and many others. And these were people who were literally featured in People magazine, right?
Yeah.
And before that, it was even more so back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Theodore Dreiser and Thomas Wolfe and William Faulkner. I mean, these were top tier celebrities, essentially. I can't think of any novelist of the serious literary sort that you ask a person on the sidewalk, you'd have more than one chance in 100 they ever heard of.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be, well, we have our CEOs and entrepreneurs and TikTok stars or something. This is what replaced our fictional visionaries.
And we have the genre people. People know the James Pattersons of the world, et cetera. But they, could you even name a top literary novelist today? When in 1960s, such people were literally known by even my parents, working class folks. They did read books, but they certainly knew who Hemingway was and Faulkner and people like that. That would certainly not be the case today. And of course, it's a lot like movie making. Movies now also collapsed to, yes, there are still good indie movies being made. And if you've got streaming services, you can find them. But the stuff that's in the movie theaters is just comic book shit, basically, right?
Yeah.
I guess there must be a market for it because they keep on making it and they ain't cheap. It's high production values. But, in terms of, are there famous directors like Billy Wilde, like there was in the day, or John Ford? Not so much, right?
Yeah, it seems there are a lot fewer and far between. Yeah, maybe partially it's just like the fractured nature, the fractal nature of culture these days is that, broad appeal is that much more of a rare thing. The first thing that I could think of is like, if there's anybody right now from a filmmaking perspective that might fall into that category would be, and maybe this isn't broad just because I'm a nerd, it would be Denis Villeneuve, who's about to come out with Dune and did Blade Runner and things. But yeah, not a huge kind of cultural agreement around that. I bet if I brought up that name, a lot of people would not have no idea who the hell I was talking about.
I'm one of them, right? I certainly know Dune. I know Blade Runner.
Yeah.
I thought Ridley Scott did Blade Runner.
He did, yeah. Scott did the original Blade Runner. Villeneuve did he just did that remake, Blade Runner 2049 or whatever. And Arrival. Arrival, as you were talking about fiction writers that I feel like should have some of the references. Ted Chiang, have you read any of his stuff?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because that's what the Arrival was based off of, one of his short stories. And yeah, that was actually something like new and interesting, and but now we're going back to Dune. So just repurposing things, repurposing culture. That seems to be the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, that's and maybe in the game B world, we can get back towards interesting and deep art, right? Of course, people say, "All right, just a goddamn old boomer," right? I go, I just finished watching a very interesting documentary series on Apple TV called 1971, the year music changed everything, and 8 episodes, some amazing footage. It's worth it for the footage alone. But, music was, seriously part of building the counterculture at that time, which was reaching its peak. And, these were grungy people. None of them were good looking and smooth, right, with a few exceptions. But they were people who were taking their music and their impact on the world seriously. Now it's all drum machines and, beautiful people with fancy haircuts and tight clothes and gym-tuned legs and all this sort of stuff. And it's just like the Empire struck back. The music scene was radical and literally countercultural in a serious way. And now it's seems, as far as I can tell, I'm sure there must be some indie corners like Americana and certain areas of hip hop, etc. But in general, what we think of as pop music today is sort of banal commercial shit driven by the almighty dollar.
Yeah, it's a weird world. But the other strange thing at the same time is that, to your point, there are a bunch of indie places that are, in culture, in all of the different artistic ventures, whether it's music or movies and things like that. And because of the accessibility and connected nature, there's a lot of indie artists who make a living off of it. They're not famous, they're not pop stars, and they're not cultural icons or things like that. But I think there's probably a broader diversity of independent creators and artists and things like that who are able to make a living with a modest audience of some sort. But you got to dig to find them and kind of go deep down the cultural, the subcultural rabbit holes to find them, it seems like.
Yeah. And then in some sense, that's a good thing. Though musicians have been heavily hard hit by the changes in the world. There used to be thousands of musicians who could make a living touring and selling CDs or albums before that. Now there's really no market for CDs. The amount of money from streaming services and downloads from, iTunes or something is a sixth or a tenth of typically what it was when people were selling CDs. And I know a lot of musicians actually, and they all lament the fact that their main ways of making a living were gutted by the electronic revolution. Though I suppose there's on the flip side, it's now costs almost nothing to produce your own records or your own tune. So if you can figure out how to zeitgeist surf and find a market, you no longer need a studio contract and $1,000 an hour studio time and pressing 5,000 copies and all that sort of stuff. And you can literally cut a production quality track yourself if you're willing to spend a little time on learning the tools. So it's probably a different world, but it's much more fragmented and such.
Oh yeah, it's a lot more chaotic, that's for sure.
Yeah, it says, and it's actually you'll talk about what the world needs: better curation. I would love to be able to find really good music, for instance, very contemporary music. Yes, I have my genres, which I know all the players in or most of them, but there must be genres even I don't even know about. But how would I know about that, right? It used to be you'd read Rolling Stone to hear about the new genres, but I'm sure they're not in Rolling Stone anymore.
Yeah, it's niche blogs and Twitter profiles, and it seems I've dipped my toe in some of the indie music scenes and try and keep up to listen to new stuff, and it's hard though. It takes a lot of deliberate effort. There's not a lot of ready-made curation, that's for sure.
It sounds like there's a market there, sort of I don't know what I'm trying to think about here. Something like the old Life magazine, right? They were the curators of 1962. Of course, there was so much less of everything that they perhaps could do it. And the Overton window, the level of ideas that people were considering in 1962 was extremely narrow, unlike today where ideas are from one extreme to another in multiple dimensions. But man, hey, you young entrepreneurs out there, think about it. A sampler, Whole Earth Review is another example. A sampler of ultra high quality stuff from the fringes.
Yeah, that'd be good.
That's not a bad idea.
Well, Interestingly, I kind of think that like this modern thing of the influencer, the internet influencer or something, these individual personalities end up kind of putting their stamp of approval on certain fashion and music and other trends and things like that, where they kind of probably do act like a subtle form of curation, but it's just like utterly personalized to this is what I like, as opposed to pulling in a broader perspective.
That's a good point. The role of the internet influencer. I read something rather scary that apparently the number 2 job after a medical doctor, when you ask a 14-year-old what they want to be when they grow up, is internet influencer.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's understandable. I mean, you have a lot of cultural power. And if you're at the top, presumably you make a pile of money, right?
Yeah.
And you sit around in your jammies and just do your thing.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think the real interesting, I mean, there's always people who figure out how to game the system, and just the only thing they do is be an influencer, which is such an absurd kind of thing.
And then they get paid to be an influencer.
Exactly.
And they do product placements, and that shit ought to be illegal. I don't know, probably not illegal, but it's certainly immoral. It's like pollution of the meme space.
Yeah, they just need like they need like a scarlet letter on them, like this person is just a product. But yeah, the interesting influencers, I think, are always the ones who have done something well and really mastered some sort of domain or expression or art or something like that. And yeah, like you got to keep it a little bit more real in some sense, not so sold out.
Well, I guess us, kind of niche podcasters are internet influences in our own little way. I mean, my guests have told me that appearing on my show sold a fair number of books for them, more so, many more so than, going on bookstore tours and stuff like that. So we're influencers our own little narrow way, but I don't think either of us are going to have 7 million followers on TikTok anytime soon.
Oh, God, that sounds terrible. I wouldn't want it if I could have it. I did have a couple other things that I wanted to jump into. One of them, just kind of reflecting broadly on the podcast, and this could be very specific about episodes or guests, or just general themes or things that what kind of stands out for you when you think about the podcast over the past 190 episodes or whatever it was. Yeah, what's the thing that's maybe the most pride or most interest or just most passion that comes up when you think about that?
Well, in terms of pride, passion, the fact that I stuck with the theme of the podcast, real thinking about deep ideas. I really do think we were able to deliver on that. There are, of course, a few exceptions, but most of the conversations were really pretty deep. I really got into it with people in a positive way. And again, one of the decisions I made on the fly as we go is to mostly keep it positive. Did not invite guests on for the purposes of arguing with them. Even when I brought people on that I knew I would be arguing with them, we established some guidelines in advance to minimize the arguments, keep it on the upbeat, but we went deep. And again, many of the guests told me, offline afterwards that, wow, that was really a deep foray. And some of the scientists even said, made me think about new things in my research program. And so I think we did achieve that of not being superficial.
Yeah.
And trying to engage the material as intensely as I could. Some areas I knew more about or had more interest in and could engage more intensely, and some less. But I felt very good that I didn't fake it and that I really got down to it. Another interesting thing is how it happened to fall out into the categories that we talked about. Originally I had, technology, science, literary fiction, and Americana music. Well, it turned out fiction and Americana music mostly went out the window. And science and technology kind of got much more emphasis. And then the third one that came in was what I guess I would call radical social change. And those have turned out to be many of the most interesting episodes and certainly had the highest listenership. Things in the Game B space, in political metamodernism, some of the more innovative projects in the blockchain world, regenerative ecology. We had a number of people from the regenerative ecology world on, sort of how are we going to save the world from our own madness? I think that ended up actually probably being my number one category, though I still have lots of artificial intelligence stuff, a lot of complexity science people from the Santa Fe Institute, and adjacent spaces. But yeah, that was also interesting how those sort of three topics, science, technology, and radical social change, became the really three foci. And I tried to tie some lines between them, which I think I was at least somewhat successful at doing.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, and it's interesting when earlier you talked about how you're a good talker. Your daughter said you're a good talker. You should do this podcast. I was like, well, talking is one thing, but when things are working, when I'm listening to an episode where you actually are kind of resonating with the person and appreciating each other's experience or worldviews and things like that, and doing some actual exploration, I think it would fall into like that category that Tyson Yunkaporta would put as like, it's a yarn, like you got to kind of see this kind of organic thing develop, which is this conversation, this exploration. And, to your point on some of the scientists and things, and people that came on that had kind of very specific areas of expertise. I feel like those kind of conversations, like of genuine exploration and curiosity and appreciation too, and kind of kindness, like the moment that you're attacking somebody is the moment that everybody's going to start getting defensive. The yarn becomes a knot, a nest, a rat's nest of tangled messes. So, yeah, I don't know. I just as an outside observer, I think that disposition, that curiosity and kindness is kind of like essential to having really interesting conversations and exploring new topics, because people have to feel like they're not having to defend something or something like that.
Yeah, I think you caught that, because that was certainly my intent. And I can't think of any, harsh arguments that I got into with anybody. In fact, a few people I had that were, had some controversy or some shit in their past or whatever. I told them right up front in the email, in conversation before they agreed to come on, I don't play gotcha. I'm not interested in this, that, or the other thing somebody might play gotcha with. I'm here to talk about your ideas and their implications. And people would appreciate that. Oh, yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned Tyson Yunkaporta. He was certainly one of my favorites. I know we're not supposed to love one child more than any other, right? And every single episode I'm proud of. Not a single bummer in the list, but my four or five conversations with Tyson Yunkaporta are way up there among some of my favorite shows.
Yeah, me too. What
an interesting person he is in his book, Sand Talk. If you haven't read Sand Talk, people, Jim tells you go read Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta.
Yeah, and talking about like novel exploration, the two of you, him coming from this kind of very natural relationship with the environment and culture and spirituality and all of this stuff that he's bringing into there, but him being able to use technical language and make some correlations to complexity science and things like that. That the difference between you two and your kind of genuine your actual perspectives is what made that conversation so interesting. And it wasn't a fight. You guys weren't. It wasn't science versus indigenous wisdom. It was how are they actually in relationship and how do they relate to each other? Those are some of my favorites of the first thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about all the episodes that really stood out. It was Tyson's series as well. So we must be on a same wavelength.
They were great. And I learned a hell of a lot. It opened my eyes. And I think it opened his. In fact, actually, he and I are engaged now in a scientific collaboration where we're going to use, with the permission of the tribal elders, and he went and got that amazingly. We're going to implement, well, actually, I shouldn't say, but it's a evolutionary computation exercise that uses some indigenous ideas. And I probably shouldn't give the secret away of the paper, but Tyson and I just really hit it off. I don't know, just something about it. He and I, we like to joke, hey, we're like brothers from different mothers, right?
Totally. I get that vibe.
Yeah, it was really, really fun. Another one of my favorite episodes, I'm going to reach out to him soon, see if he's got something new, is Nick Chater's episode on The Mind is Flat. I'm not sure he was correct. He might be. But he radically challenges all the conventional wisdom about depth psychology and all this stuff going inside your head and such. And he says, we're way shallower than we like to think. We're basically our memories plus a confabulation machine, and that's it. And I've referenced that a dozen times at least in other podcasts, challenging deep depth psychology perspectives from folks, and say, hey, have you read Nick Chater's book, The Mind is Flat? It might change your thinking a little bit. And as I said, I'm still not 100% convinced, but he makes a pretty good argument. And so that was so fun because it was so non conventional wisdom, shall we say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Especially from our modern kind of context, in the sense that our culture seems to be kind of permeated by psychotherapeutic perspective. It's almost like the water that we swim in. Everybody knows a little bit about subconscious and baggage and trauma and everything. So yeah, I always appreciate being able to kind of break out of that frame and be like, wait a second, is this really have to be everywhere? Let's look at it a little bit more fundamentally.
Yeah, his of course is the ultra skeptical perspective. That was on episode 75. Nick Chater, for those of you who want to check it out. Yeah, that was certainly a really fun episode, which has come back, again and again. Another one that I just really loved, it was one of my favorite topics, is Doug Irwin on EP 116, where we dug into the Cambrian explosion, which is when essentially all multicellular life, it's a slight overstatement, but almost all the phyla of life that we know today came into existence in an extraordinarily short period of time, like 5 million years, in this very specific window called the Cambrian explosion. That was an amazing conversation, because it also allowed us to talk about the nature of evolution, the invention of neurons and all kinds of wild stuff. And Doug Irwin, being a guy from both the Santa Fe Institute and the Smithsonian Institute, is an extraordinarily well-prepared guy to have that discussion with. So that was another one that was just really, really good.
Yeah, I remember that one vaguely. I'm gonna have to, now that we're talking through some of these, I'm like, I'm gonna have to go listen to that episode again. I was like, a refresher would be really fun. I'm curious. You said that you and Tyson have actually ended up working on projects since the podcast. Is there any other kind of collaborations or projects and things that have come up that kind of were first kind of initiated, or maybe even kind of just aided by, or kind of given a boost from any of the podcast episodes or guests?
Yeah, I've developed a good working relationship with Greg Henriques, who I did a couple of podcasts with, and we're working on some stuff. And he's helping me on actually more to the point, and I'm helping him a little bit on some of the things he's working on. Certainly deepened my relationship with some other folks like Simon DeDeo and Max Borders. Michelle Bowens, actually, Michael Bowen, Michelle Bowens and I are working on something together now that I think about it. So yeah, there's been a number of ongoing things that have been initiated, and I've been advising the Consilience Project, which some of our guests have been associated with, most well-known Daniel Schmachtenberger, but also Zach Stein and Samo Berja. All three of them are key contributors to the Consilience Project, and I'm an advisor to that project. And so there's another connection. Yeah, so it certainly richened my network of people and projects and stuff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because so many of the things that I ended up focusing on, so I ended a podcast of my own. God, it was a little over a year ago now or something like that. But, like I'm just starting to kind of realize, like, man, I really miss all of the connections and all of the kind of, unplanned creative stuff and relationships and things like that had come from it. And it was not as obvious when it was running, but yeah, and I'm glad you're continuing on too, and not completely closing things down.
Yeah, and going down this list, Rich Bartlett is involved with around the edges and some Proto-B work we're doing, and I continue to communicate with Mark Burgess on various things. Yeah, it's been remarkable. It's actually, I hadn't really focused on so much how much it has added to my network of collaboration, idea sharing, and project doing. It's been quite a good upgrade.
Yeah. Well, and it has the heart too. Again, I'm the spiritual guy, because I guess I was on an old episode as well, talking about spirituality. So I'm always the woo woo one in the crew. But I always feel like when I talk about your podcast to people and who have no idea who you are or something like that, you're like, oh, you produced a podcast before, and I kind of give them the cliff notes of Jim Rutt, and I said that he's a straight shooter with a big heart. And the big heart is I think one of the things that's the most endearing and maybe doesn't get a ton of attention, but I think it's the key to the success of the show.
I appreciate that. Well, I got one announcement to make, even though I famously say when I hear the word metaphysics, I reach for my pistol, and I call spirituality the other S word. Guess who started doing a program of meditation 3 days ago?
Oh, shit.
Yo! As I was working my way through Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, it became clear he was about to start talking about mindfulness. And I said, well, I really ought to just listen to him talk about it. I ought to do it, right? And so I asked some folks what they thought was a good, specifically mindfulness meditation book, pamphlet, app. And amazingly, 5 out of 5 said Sam Harris's Waking Up. Mm-hmm. And of course, I felt comfortable with Sam Harris, him also being a bloody atheist like myself and a real cognitive scientist as opposed to one who plays a cognitive scientist on TV occasionally, myself. And I said, okay, probably Sam Harris doesn't offend me on principle, and he's not likely to get a bunch of woo-woo shit and divas and celestial spheres and all that kind of nonsense. And so I downloaded his app, and I'll tell you, it's goddamn good. 3 days in a row, boom, boom, boom. I look forward to doing it every morning. And I've signed up for his 28-day startup course, and basically one meditation thing and then a discussion by him about the sort of the meaning and importance of this particular thing and related thing. Anyway, I give it so far an A after 3 days.
Nice.
So guess what? I'm going to be a spiritual warrior, folks, out there soon. So watch out. If this shit really does give you superpowers, I'll be even more super powerful than I was before.
That's good. Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of Sam as well. He was his book that has the S word in it. I can't remember what it was called. What was it? Something in spirituality. We'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, Sam's book was hugely influential for me, going from being a very kind of seeing meditation as a kind of performance enhancement drug, kind of like a little bit of a little boost that I could go do every day for a few minutes, to actually getting interested in like, well, what's the deep end here? So yeah, I don't know. I would definitely not be a teacher and everything if it weren't for Sam kind of, initially pushing me off on the path. So, and the way he communicates is very approachable from a Western perspective, and rationality isn't some sort of bad word or something like that. So I always appreciate his perspectives as well.
Yeah. So anyway, that's another new announcement. One of the new things I'm doing with my copious spare time now that I'm not doing 2 or 3 podcasts a week.
So Salty Jim is going to turn into Enlightened Jim now.
Aum. I don't know where Aum is. I think that's Hindu, isn't it?
It's everywhere. Yeah,
okay.
It's all over the place.
You can see me attempting to do a lotus position. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, lotus. Oof, yeah, not meant for the Western body.
Especially not fat old dudes like myself with bad joints.
Yeah, well, skinny dudes like myself don't do the lotus either, so don't feel bad.
All right, that's a good thing to hear.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I had anything else on my list. This was a fun little meander through the past and future of the podcast. Anything left that you wanted to kind of cover before we wrap up here? And
no, not really. I think we did hit everything, and had fun. And I want to thank you for suggesting this. This was actually a great idea, and I've enjoyed doing it, and I will continue to enjoy working with you. You've been a very important part of the podcast. It would not be nearly as good without both your technical work as an audio editor, also just as a collaborator and a comrade and a person to run ideas by. And we just had a really good experience working together for the last year and a half or so. It's almost 2 years now.
It is. Likewise. Yeah, I've loved working on the podcast, and you were kind of the landing pad out of corporate America for me. So also just like very pivotal at me learning how to be more self-sufficient and have a bunch of other projects happening and everything. But it was all built on the foundation of Jim Rutt Show. So a lot of gratitude, and excited to see how things continue to evolve.
All righty. Why don't we wrap her there?
All right. Take care.
Production services and audio editing by Jared Janes Consulting. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.